Today we're going to look at one of the ideologies to come out of this industrial imperial age that continues to seriously affect our politics in the modern day, and that is nationalism. Nationalism is controversial and people use the word to mean a bunch of different things. So today we're going to look at its history, what it means, and how it was formed, how it affects our understanding of history and the present day. As we go through this lesson, try to consider, what is the relationship between nations and their history? Why is history and nationalism, why are they so closely connected? Next, can you think of examples of historical stories that form the backbone of American nationalism? And then third, centering back to our historical context, why do you think having a large empire might be useful in promoting nationalism? As advanced warning, by the time we get to studying World War I in just a few lessons, you're going to need to be very familiar with the nations represented on this map of Europe. Specifically, you'll need to be able to identify Britain, England, the United Kingdom. Those are all three terms for the same basic island. France, Russia, Germany, Italy, Poland, and Austria on a blank map. The reason for this is it's really difficult to understand the story of what happened in the 20th century without being able to visualize it on a map. So as we go through today's lesson, which is about nations, we're also going to talk about the history of some of these places, and being able to connect specific details with locations is really, really helpful in learning where places are, so you don't end up just staring at a map and trying to memorize it. So as we go through today's lesson, try to jot down details for each location so that you can start to be thinking spatially as we go through these places. For reference, A is Britain, B is France, C is Germany, D is Russia, E is Italy, F is Poland, and G is Austria. Let's start with a little vocabulary. If you don't remember this from world geography, this is definitely something you're going to want to write down. First, the difference between a state and a nation. A state is a legally defined territory with a border, a government, and laws. It is what you probably think of when you think of the word country, which is just a state that's officially recognized in international law. Now, Americans can get this confused because the United States uses this word a little bit differently. So for our purposes as social studies students, a state would be like the United States, Mexico, France, Russia, the Congo. Those are all states. The reason the United States calls like districts like Texas a state is because they used to be independent, but they no longer are when they united into the United States. Anyway, a state is the place. It's a place with a border. You can see it on a map. It has a government. It has its own laws. A nation is subtle. It is the people within a state, or who don't have a state, but a group of people who feel a sense of belonging together. It's subtle because it's not something you can just point to objectively and see, but it is a combination of history, language, culture, in some cases ethnicity, sometimes religion. But like having those things in common make a group of people feel united. And that sense of unity as a people is referred to as a nation. Usually, people get a sense of personal identity from belonging to this nation, right? So like you can think of a nation in terms of like in the United States, people who feel like they're Americans, who really identify with the Constitution or whatever it is that they think of when they think of America, Americans, with their flags in the front yards. That's the nation. The state would be the United States with the border. Sometimes states and nations aren't located in the same place, right? Sometimes there's a nation of people who don't have a state. For example, the Cherokee Nation is not independent, but it is a group of people who feel a strong sense of identity from their common culture and history, the Cherokee people who live within the United States. When they do overlap, when the border of a place and the people within it feeling a sense of identity with that place are the same, we call that a nation state. A nation state is a state full of people who are proud to be part of the community of people within the state, with a shared culture and history from which they draw a sense of unity and identification. It's the feeling shared by people in a state that the state is valid and they can identify with other people in it, and that gives the state a sense of legitimacy. It's subtle, right? So like nation is like the people who feel a sense of belonging and commonality. A state is the place. When the people are represented by a state, we call that a nation state. Like America, the United States represents Americans. It's a nation state. In cases when they don't match, when the people within the border don't feel that sense of identity with the state that rules over them, or not all of the people do, you tend to get conflict, like civil wars. Another way that you're going to see this pretty often in history when they don't match is through imperialism. When the Belgians from Europe conquered the Congo in Africa, the people who were there in Africa before, the Congolese, didn't suddenly feel a sense of unity and belonging for being Belgian, right? They were still very much Congolese. They were ruled over by people who did not represent them, or so they felt, right? So nations and states didn't overlap when one state conquers another. This is like a subtle concept, but it's important. So do try to keep that distinction in mind. Today we're focusing on the nation part of the story, right? And you can think of a nation as an imagined community. It is the sense that people in a state have that they have something significant in common that makes them different from people in other states. Usually that thing in common will come from a particular historical narrative. In other words, a way of telling their history, a shared history. But it can also come from a shared language, a shared culture, that sort of thing. The sense of having something major in common tends to be spread in schools, textbooks, public rituals, and so forth. So, we celebrate, well, not all of us celebrate Columbus Day if we know what we're doing, but in theory, we're supposed to celebrate Columbus Day, and that's supposed to give everybody in the United States a common sense of pride. We celebrate the 4th of July, so everybody in the nation has that as a holiday, and that gives people something significant in common that is linked to the state that we live in. This sense of imagined community is important because it gives people from different parts of the state something that they can relate on. It's the thing that means that, like, even though I've never been to South Dakota, I can imagine that if I go there, I'm going to have some significant things in common with the people who live there because we belong to the same nation state. In the cases when nations don't have a state that represents them yet, whether they've been imperialized or they just haven't formed a state, a nation is the sense that there is a community of people with something significant in common, and they should have their own state. They should be independent. Nations and nationalism tend to also have a lot to do with a feeling of pride in one's country and a sense that it is in some way superior to or better than other countries and other nations and other states. And this brings us to nationalism. When people use the word nationalism, they can use it in one of two ways, and distinguishing the two can be really useful. We're going to use the two throughout the rest of the year in world history. The first type of nationalism, and actually I'd suggest that you guys write this down, is state formation related. People who wish to be represented in their own state and aren't as of yet. We're going to see this in two stories today, the unification of Germany and Italy. And those are cases where there were groups of people who shared the same language, the same culture, the same history, who were not yet represented by one state, and then they united and became one state. And then we're also going to see it in short order as a feeling among colonized people of not identifying with the state that conquered them and wanting independence, wanting to be represented by their own state, not ruled over by somebody different. We're going to see this clearly through colonization and then later decolonization, but also in a really important land empire in Europe, Austria-Hungary, in a way that's going to help start the First World War. So that's state formation related nationalism, feeling of a people that they want to be represented by their own state and they aren't yet. The next way that the word nationalism is used is usually related to people who are already represented by their own state. And in that case, nationalism refers to an almost aggressive or belligerent or xenophobic feeling of superiority over or entitlement over other states and other people that come from belonging to the national group or state that you identify with. This means like not just being proud of being from your state, but feeling like you are better than other people because you belong to the state that you belong to. And as a result, you are entitled to act in a way that you would not accept other people acting. To be perfectly frank, Donald Trump is a wonderful example of this kind of aggressive, exclusive nationalism. He usually defines the nation, or this type of nationalism usually defines the nation very exclusively, so like only referring to one limited group of people, in his case, white people. And it's usually defined by contrast. So America can be discussed as a wonderful place because of its values and because of its Enlightenment heritage. But when nationalists discuss America, it's usually in contrast to the people they feel like do not belong. So negative depictions of immigrants, negative depictions of people from other countries, even negative depictions of people from different races within the state. We're going to be seeing a lot of this type of nationalism throughout history, and this is the type of nationalism that really drove imperialism, especially towards the beginning. This is something that we can also tie to our longstanding theme of othering, of civilization and barbarians, right? How do you find who's civilized? How do you define the barbarians? We've seen throughout history that these divisions tend to be endemic to human groups, right? When the Neolithic Revolution happened, people who formed cities and those advanced cultures looked down on people who did not belong, looked down on the hunter-gatherers. Then in the next unit, we saw this defined in terms of belonging to an empire, like Rome, versus not the people that Rome conquered. We could also see this in terms of religion, especially in the post-classical period. And then in the early modern period, we saw increasingly a distinction in terms of race, right? So nationalism is another iteration of this tendency of groups to define themselves exclusively and as better than others. We're going to look at this version of nationalism first. Nationalism as promoted by established states, the superiority kind, the feeling like you are better than others because of the state that you belong in. Because the history of this version of aggressive nationalism really starts in the Industrial Revolution. As we've seen, the Industrial Revolution created new social classes. And because of urbanization, they all shared the same space often in big cities, right? You had the upper class of capitalists who were rich because they owned stuff, and you had a mass of lower class proletariat, working class, unskilled wage laborers who were increasingly impoverished by industrial capitalism. With this change in the hierarchy and in the location of these classes, you had the potential for a giant political problem. If these huge numbers of workers all got frustrated at the upper class at the same time, revolutions could happen. And this was something with serious precedent in Europe and something that people in power very seriously did not want to happen. Because of increasing political awareness of this group too, because of the rise of newspapers and just more information circulating to them, they became politically important. Not like the priority of governments or anything like that, but they couldn't be ignored. And so, because of this new masses of politically involved people, plus urbanization, lots of working class people concentrated in cities, and the visible inequality that existed there could become politically dangerous. And so people in power had to try to keep this new social group at least peaceably happy. And this led to lots of things that we still live with today, including propaganda to shape their opinions. Propaganda is information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote a particular political cause or point of view. And nationalism to keep them in support of the state. If you could get the working class of a country to be proud of being part of that state, you could pretty much guarantee peace in a way that was really important if you're in power. It also promoted scapegoating, and these are all, parts of the same process. Scapegoating would be like targeting minority groups in times of economic crisis and kind of blaming them for it, which is also a part of nationalism. So let's look at what nationalism is. Nationalism is a political ideology created by the emergence of mass politics and the competition between states that promotes personal loyalty and identification with the state and the system of values it represents in the age of mass politics. This means it promotes getting a serious sense of identity from the place you belong. It's not just living in America, it's feeling like you are American, like deep down in your core. Mass politics is politics in the age in which the vast majority of the population, the masses, is politically aware, and the government has to take that into account to remain in power. So this began with the Industrial Revolution. Nationalism says that people of all classes should identify first and foremost with belonging to the state. For contrast, communism says that people should identify first and foremost with their class, no matter what state they're in. This is a pretty big difference, and the conflict between nationalism and communism is going to play out several times throughout the next century or two. Nationalism really began, and here I'm getting in trouble with historians that I know, but like for our purposes, nationalism really took off in the 18th century, in the 1700s, with the Industrial Revolution and the American Revolution and, the age of revolutions. During this time, people around the world started to develop a sense of commonality based on language, religion, social custom, and territory. These newly imagined national communities linked their identity with the borders of the state. And governments use this idea to unite diverse populations. And if you can unite diverse populations, you have the makings for a peaceful state without revolution. As an added bonus, and here's something you should pay attention to, especially in your future history classes, when public schools began to be established, one of the goals was to teach nationalism. So to teach perhaps a patriotic version of history that's not necessarily the full version of history. As we've seen, propaganda was used to foster nationalism and to give people clearly different groups of others to contrast them favorably against. So this could be people from the empire or minority groups that the working class could vent their frustrations on. Social Darwinism, for example, was an ideology that began to emerge that could help rally the working class against an enemy that wasn't the rich. If you were a nationalist and you saw a propaganda picture like this, and you were from the United States, perhaps you would feel pride in being from what looks to be from this propaganda to be the superior culture. This is horrible and racist, but this is kind of the way it has worked throughout history, and if you pay attention to the news, it's the way it still works. In the age of empire, having an empire and the contrast between people at home and people that were conquered was a huge part of promoting nationalism. And in turn, nationalism fed the empire. With more nationalist population, you had a more pro-empire population, and that encouraged further colonization. Here, for example, is a children's book from Britain during the time of imperialism. Think about how the images and the words are being used to persuade British children to believe in and support imperialism. B stands for Britain, by which England's name has forever been covered with glory and fame. Pretty okay so far. C is for colonies, rightly we boast, that of all the great nations, Great Britain has most. So one thing to be proud of as a Briton is that you have more colonies than everybody else, okay? E is our empire where sun never sets. The larger we make it, the bigger it gets. And then it gets kind of racist. K is for kings, once warlike and haughty. Great Britain subdued them because they'd been naughty. So like the people we conquer are bad and that's why we took over them. O is the ocean where none but a fool would ever dare question our title to rule. So our Navy is really important to nationalism too. Hopefully you're getting a sense of how this is a constructed idea, and that nationalism, at its core, is all about a feeling of superiority or entitlement over other states that comes from belonging to a nation that you identify with in often aggressive or exclusive terms. As we've seen, imperialism led to nationalism by concentrating workers in cities, and nationalism was a way to bind their loyalty to the nation as opposed to, for example, their social class, which could wade into the territory of revolution. Nationalism, meaning having that sense of superiority over others, was another way of legitimizing empire. Imperialism and nationalism fed off of each other. Having an empire was something to be proud of, and that promoted nationalism at home. Imperialism also caused nationalism in parts of the world that the West, the imperial industrial powers, took over. Because when you are taken over by a very different group of people, you often resent that group of people and find a sense of serious commonality with the people who were at home with you before. In many cases, the effects of this wouldn't be felt until after the World Wars, when all of these colonies that had just been dominated started to fight for their independence. But in one part of the world, as we've seen, even in the age of imperialism, this occurred almost immediately. After the United States attempted to force trade with Japan, for example, Japan responded by actively creating a sense of nationalism in its population, and then industrializing, and then becoming an imperial power itself, conquering neighboring areas. Nationalism and the competition between the great powers of Europe were also very closely intermixed, and I'm emphasizing this because this is going to lead pretty directly to World War I. The great powers in Europe competed with each other for colonies. They started building up larger and larger armies to conquer and defend those colonies. And having a nationalist population meant having more potential soldiers and more potential people to send out to the colonies. After all, why fight for a state if it's not the best state? Speaking of the great powers, two states on this map did not exist before the Industrial Age and joined together to form a state because of nationalism during the Age of Empire. And those two are Germany and Italy, and we're going to look at their formation in a second. For now, please pause the slide here and get this information in your notes, ideally summarized. Hopefully, you can take some of this information and depict it in drawings or in a concept map. Remember, the goal of notes is to get a lot of information condensed. So please pause here, take notes, and then press play again so we can look at nationalism as related to state formation. So we've looked at the state version of nationalism, like I'm American and I'm better than you because I'm American, the aggressive superiority type of ideology that was promoted during this time period and even today. Now we're going to look at nationalism as related to state formation. In other words, the version of nationalism that exists when there are people that feel like they have something serious in common, whether it's language, history, religion, a traditional homeland, a sense of common destiny. They don't have a state yet that represents them, and they form one, or they want to. And for this purposes, we're going to be looking at the formation of Germany and Italy, two of the great powers in Europe, honestly Germany much more than Italy, that formed in the late 1800s and whose formation is going to contribute to World War I down the line. As a reminder, you need to know where these places are on a blank map, like soon. Luckily for you, as we go through this next section, you're going to be learning a lot of detail about most of these places. I say most because Poland didn't exist at the time, confusingly. But as we go through this chapter, it would be a really good idea for you to keep an eye on the map, noting that A is Britain, B is France, C is Germany, D is Russia, E is Italy, F is Poland, and G is Austria, and note details that stand out to you about the situation of each of these places in this age of imperialism. And again, this is going to be really important for the next unit, so the more you pay attention here, the better off you'll be. We're going to be looking at this part of the story with the help of E.H. Gombrich's A Little History of the World. Looking at chapter 38, Two New Nation States in Europe. As we go through this chapter, consider which states were powerful in Europe in the 19th century and why? Which states were less powerful and why? In which way does nationalism help explain the unification of Germany into its own single country and the unification of Italy? And how do you think the creation of Germany and Italy might change the balance of power in Europe? First, just check out a basic map. On the left, you'll see Europe before the unification of Germany and Italy. Germany is over here in this like blob of little states, and Italy is this like blob of other little states. On the right, you'll see a much more cleaned up map of Europe just before World War I, after the unification of Germany and Italy. So this is the change that we're going to be tracing. And remember, as I read, I'm reading the book, which was written not by me, but by a historian in the 1930s. He writes, I have known many people who were children at a time before either Germany or Italy existed. It seems incredible, doesn't it, that these great and powerful nations, which play such an important role, aren't old at all. After the revolutions of 1848, when new railway lines were being built all over Europe and telegraph cables were being laid, when the towns which had turned into factory towns were expanding and many peasants were being drawn into them, and when men had taken to wearing top hats and funny pince-nez spectacles with dangling black cords, the Europe we know is still no more than a patchwork of tiny duchies, kingdoms, principalities, and republics, linked to one another by complicated ties of allegiance or enmity. In this Europe, if we ignore Britain, which was at this time more concerned with its colonies in America, India, and Australia than with the neighboring continent, there were three important powers. Those photographs are colorized pictures of Britain in the 18th century. In the center of Europe stood the Empire of Austria. There, the Emperor Franz Joseph had been ruling from the imperial palace in Vienna since 1848. I saw him once myself when I was a little boy. He was by then an old man and was crossing the park at the palace. I have also a very clear memory of his state funeral. He really was what an emperor was meant to be. He ruled over all sorts of different people and countries. He was Emperor of Austria, but he was also King of Hungary and Count elevated to the rank of Prince of the Tyrol, and had lots of other ancient titles, such as King of Jerusalem and the Protector of the Sacred Tomb, a title that went back to the Crusades. Many provinces of Italy came under his authority, while others were ruled by members of his family. Then there were the Croats, the Serbs, the Czechs, the Slovenes, the Slovaks, the Poles, and innumerable other peoples or nations. For this reason, the words on the old Austrian banknotes, for example, 10 crowns, also appeared in all these other languages. The Emperor of Austria even had some power, at least a name, in the German principalities. But the situation there was rather complicated. When Napoleon shattered the last remnants of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation in 1806, after the French Revolution, the German Empire had ceased to exist. The many German-speaking lands, which included Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony, Hanover, Frankfurt, Brunswick, and so on and so forth, then formed an association known as the German Confederation, to which Austria also belonged. All in all, it was a remarkably confusing picture, this German Confederation. Each speck of land had its own official prince, its own money, its own stamps, and its own official uniform. It was bad enough when it took several days to get from Berlin to Munich by mail coach, but now that the same journey took less than a day by train, it had almost become unendurable. The work presented by the lands of Germany, Austria, and Italy was quite unlike anything around them on the map. To the west was France. Shortly after the Revolution of 1848, it had once again become an empire. One of Napoleon's descendants had been able to reawaken memories of the glory of the past, and although far from great himself, he was first elected president of the Republic and soon afterwards Emperor of France until under the name of Napoleon III. Despite all its wars and revolutions, France was now an exceptionally rich and powerful country with great industrial cities. To the east was Russia. The Tsar was not loved in that mighty land. You must bear in mind that by this time, many Russians had studied at universities in France and Germany, and their outlook was quite modern and up to date. But the Russian Empire and its officials were still living in the Middle Ages. Just think, it was only in 1861 that serfdom was formally abolished, and then for the first time, 23 million Russian peasants were promised an existence worthy of human dignity. Making promises is one thing, but keeping them is another. In Russia, generally speaking, government was by the lash, or by the knout as it was called. The penalty for speaking freely, for expressing even the mildest opinion, was exile to Siberia at the very least. Consequently, students and members of the middle classes who had received a modern education detested the Tsar so much that he lived in constant fear of assassination. This was, in fact, the fate of most Tsars, however hard they tried to guard against it. Pause here and note which states were the most powerful in Europe, and why were they powerful? Beside the immensity of Russia and the battle-hardened might of France, it seemed impossible for any other country to make itself heard in Europe. With the loss of its Latin American colonies, beginning in 1810, Spain had become weak and powerless. Turkey, no longer in control of its European possessions, was now referred to in the newspapers as the sick man of Europe. Its various Christian subject peoples had been fighting for their liberty with the enthusiastic support of the rest of Europe. The Greeks were first, followed by the Bulgarians, the Romanians, and the Albanians, while Russia, France, and Austria fought over the rest of Turkey's European possessions and Constantinople. This was just as well for Turkey, for none of those three countries was willing to surrender such a rich prize to any of the others. So Constantinople stayed Turkish. Meanwhile, France and Austria were still fighting over the Italian dominions, as they had been for hundreds of years. But times had changed. Italians had also been brought closer to one another by their railways, and like the inhabitants of German towns, they too had come to realize that they weren't simply Florentines, Genoese, Venetians, or Neapolitans. They were all Italians, and they wished to decide their own fate. At that time, there was only one small state in northern Italy that was free and independent. It lay at the foot of the mountains over which Hannibal had once come and was called Piedmont, which means exactly that, foot of the mountains. Now Piedmont and the islands of Sardinia together formed a small but strong kingdom under one ruler, King Victor Emmanuel. And he had an exceptionally able and wily minister called Camillo Cavour, who knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted that all Italians had been yearning for, and what so many of them had shed their blood for in bold but often ill-conceived and perilous adventures, both during and after the 1848 revolution, a unified Italian kingdom. After some political maneuvering, by 1866, Italy was unified, except for Rome, which the Pope got to keep. And there I'm paraphrasing this section of the book, which we are skipping for time. In short, Italy realized that Italians had a common language, a common history, a common destiny, and they unified as a state. Next, the unification of Germany. This was Prussia, right here, in the north, whose prime minister at the time was Bismarck. Bismarck was a noble landowner from North Germany. He was a man of exceptional intelligence with a will of iron. He never lost sight of his goal and wasn't in the least bit shy of telling even King William I of Prussia exactly what he thought. From the outset, Bismarck wanted just one thing, to make Prussia mighty and use its strengths to make one great German empire out of the jumbled patchwork of the German Confederation. For this, he was convinced it was vital to have a strong and powerful army. Indeed, it was he who famously said that the great questions of history are decided not by speeches, but by blood and iron. I don't know whether that's always true, but in his case, history proved him right. The Prussian representatives were unwilling to grant him the great sum of money he needed for his army out of the people's taxes. So in 1862, he persuaded the king to rule against the Constitution and the will of Parliament. The king feared he would suffer the same fate as King Charles I of England when he failed to keep his word, and of Louis XVI of France, who both lost their heads. He was traveling with Bismarck in a railway carriage and turned to him and said, "I can see exactly where all this is leading. Down to Opera House Square, where they'll chop off your head beneath my windows, and then it'll be my turn." Bismarck merely said, "And then?" "Well, then we shall be dead," replied the king. "True," said Bismarck, "then we'll be dead. But what better death could we have?" And so it came about that, against the will of the people, a great army was equipped with a large number of guns and cannons, and was soon proving its worth against Denmark, to the north, up here. With these exceedingly well-armed and well-trained forces, Bismarck attacked Austria in 1866, down here, while the Italians were attacking from the south. His aim was to force the emperor out of the German Confederation, leaving Prussia as its most powerful member. Prussia could then leave Germany. In Bohemia, he defeated the Austrians decisively in a bloody battle. The Emperor Franz Joseph had to give in, and Austria left the Confederation. Bismarck didn't press his victory too far and made no further demands. This incensed or angered the generals and the officers of the Prussian army, but Bismarck wouldn't budge. He had no wish to make a lasting enemy of Austria. But without telling anyone, he made secret pacts with all the other German states, ensuring their support in any war Prussia chose to undertake. Meanwhile, in France, the growth of Prussian military power was making Napoleon III increasingly uneasy. He had just lost an utterly unnecessary war in Mexico in 1867 and was fearful of this well-armed neighbor across the Rhine River. In any case, the French had never felt comfortable with any growth, in German military might. King William of Prussia was staying at a hot spring resort in Ems when Napoleon III's ambassador interrupted his cure with the most extraordinary demand. On behalf of himself and his descendants, the king was to renounce, in writing, claims that he had never even made. Without the king's agreement, Bismarck then seized upon the opportunity to force Napoleon III to declare war. Against the expectations of the French, all the German states joined in, and it was soon clear that the German troops were better equipped and better led than the French. At a place called Sedan, the Germans captured a large part of the French army, which happened to include Napoleon III. They hurried on towards Paris, where they laid siege to the well-defended city for months. The defeat of France meant that the French troops in charge of the Pope's protection had to leave Rome in Italy, and this allowed the King of Italy to make his entry into Rome, during which time Rome became the capital of Italy. It was all very complicated. In short, meanwhile in France, Napoleon III, who had just lost a war with Mexico and kind of needed no further humiliation, got tricked into declaring war on Prussia. France was suspicious of its growing power because it was right next door, and Prussia wanted this war because they knew they would win, and Prussia did win. Meanwhile, during the Prussian siege of Paris, Bismarck persuaded the various German kings and princes to propose to the King of Prussia, who was staying at Versailles in France, that he accepted the title of German Emperor. You won't believe what happened next. King William insisted on being called Emperor of Germany and not German Emperor, and the whole thing nearly fell through. Finally, however, in the great gallery of mirrors at Versailles, the old palace of French kings, the creation of the German Empire was solemnly proclaimed. But the newly appointed emperor, William I, was incensed at not having the title he had wanted. In full view of everyone, shockingly and intentionally, he strode past Bismarck, refusing to shake the hand of the empire's founder. Despite this, Bismarck continued to serve him, and served him well. Trouble brewing. In Paris, during the months of the siege, a dreadful and bloody workers' revolt had broken out, which was later suppressed with even greater bloodshed. More people died in it than in the whole of the French Revolution. For a while afterwards, France was powerless, and the French were forced to make peace with Prussia, Germany. They had to hand over a large part of their country to Germany, a part called Alsace and Lorraine, which will become an issue during World War I, together with a large sum of money. Because he had ruled so badly, the French dismissed Napoleon III and founded a republic. They had had enough of emperors or kings, and they wouldn't ever have one ever again. Bismarck was now Chancellor, or Prime Minister, of a unified German Empire, and he governed with great authority. He was a fierce opponent of the sort of socialist action recommended by Karl Marx, but he knew about only the appalling conditions of the workers. He believes that the only way to stop the spread of Marx's teachings of communism was to allay the worst hardships of the workers so that they no longer wanted to turn the whole state upside down. So he created organizations to give support to workers who were sick or who had accidents, who would otherwise have died from lack of assistance, and he did his best to ensure that the worst poverty was reduced. Even so, all workers in those days still had to work a 12-hour day, including Sundays. Prince Bismarck, with his bushy eyebrows and his stern and resolute expression, was soon one of the best-known men in Europe. Even his enemies agreed that he was a great statesman. When the people of Europe wanted to set about dividing up the world with imperialism, which was now so much smaller, the world was, that is, they met together in Berlin in 1878, and Bismarck led the discussions. But when a new German emperor came along, the two were constantly at odds. After many disagreements with his chancellor, William II could stand it no longer and dismissed him. Bismarck, now an old man, retired to his ancestral state. There he lived for several more years, sending messages to the new leaders of the German government to warn them of the blunders they were making. In summary, the situation in the early 1900s was this. The German nation was united and formed a state called Germany. The Italian nation was united and formed a state called Italy. Russia was still basically in the Middle Ages with a feudal system, an aristocracy, no industrialization, but also a ton of land and a giant army. Britain was busy building her empire and her navy. Austria-Hungary was a multi-ethnic land empire held together by a shaky emperor who had just lost some land to Prussia, but wasn't too bitter about it. France was very bitter about losing land to Germany, which has a huge army and was right next door. And all of these states were competing for colonies to have the largest military, and all of them were becoming increasingly pretty nationalist about it all, which will spell trouble down the line. If you'd like to review the key points from today's lesson, again, here they are.